So, very happy to be here with you guys today. It's a wonderful opportunity to share a topic that is quite controversial, quite beautiful, and quite deep at the same time. So, let's fasten our seatbelts and enjoy the ride as much as we can. And the name of the lecture is also important to highlight because it's called A Perspective of Sex and Sexuality from Spiritism. We're going to endeavor to have a reflection and a conversation in the next half hour or so about a topic which can easily be discussed for a whole weekend, and still at the end of it people may have many, many questions. So we're going to do the best we can to just cover a few topics. The point of the lecture is to talk about sex and sexuality from the vantage point of the eternal spirit, and then compare that information with what we know in sociology, psychology, and make that contrast. So, and of course, as some of you may know, I always will like to infuse a little bit of music in every lecture. This one will also have some music, because if I can't make you feel the comfort and the peace and the joy in the information given, then I will entrust that the music will do that for sure. So, responsibility is off my shoulders. So, disclaimer, I am not a scientist, I am not a doctor, I am not a sexologist, I am not an expert in this field. Just a disclaimer so that what we're going to be sharing today is information that I had a chance to read from various sources in Spiritist books and in my research that we did putting together this lecture. So this is meant to be a conversation, a reflection, and in no way, shape, or form meant to be anything judgmental or a morality conversation on what the do's and don'ts of sex and sexuality. That's not what the point of this lecture is. So, in order for us to jump right in, let's get you guys talking a little bit. And don't be shy. There is no wrong answer. So, why don't you start talking to us? We'll have this conversation, and then we'll jump into the lecture. So, let's start by asking these questions. What is the goal of sex? One of them, reproduction. Pleasure. Reproduction, pleasure. Love. Unity. Unity. Energy exchange. Wow. Reproduction, love, unity, energy exchange, pleasure, connection. All right, these are great answers. They're one-word answers, very succinct. So, okay, these are some of the goals of sex. Why are we attracted to sex?
Because it's the ultimate pleasure, I guess, for the brain.
Ah, it's the ultimate pleasure for the brain. Nice. Did you see my slides? Okay, very good.
I've been here for a while.
You've been here for a while, I see. Good. It's the ultimate pleasure for the brain. What else? Don't be shy. There's no wrong answer. Because of the hormones and because of our physiology? Okay, yes.
The necessity to reproduce.
Necessity for reproduction, right? What else?
Release stress.
Release stress. So we are in an incarnate physical world, right? Endorphin production, okay. Ties in with what Jayutu said about the brain. Okay. Anything else?
Being the most intense type of energy exchange between two beings, after doing it, we carry a bit of the other person within us.
Being the most intense type of energy exchange, we carry a bit of the other person within us afterwards. I'm just repeating for the camera. Okay. Anybody agree with that? Disagree with that? TJ?
No, I agree with it. I think it's a sacred bond.
Sacred bond? Wow. Why do we need to have this lecture? We're done. This is great. How does our society view sex? People are nodding their heads like this.
The Catholic,
In general, taboo.
Taboo?
the Catholic religion says it's only for reproduction. And that's it.
The Catholic religion says it's only for reproduction and that's it.
Sacred.
Has our society views sex as sacred?
Some of them.
Some of them, okay. Our 21st century Western society that we live in, right? There are many societies, right?
I think that, especially here in America, we view it as a subject that we don't like to discuss openly. Like it's not one that traditionally Americans have a free expression around.
It's like taboo, as Jairton said.
I think in the view of every society, every people in history, we find a very common ground in regards to sex as pleasure.
Sex as pleasure.
Yes.
Okay.
A lot of prejudice.
A lot of prejudice.
On it, yeah.
Okay.
Advertising.
Secretive advertising, so media, right? The way we're fed in the media in our society, the views of sex. And then, is there a healthy versus an unhealthy sex?
Oh yes.
Oh, yes. Sure? Such as?
Well, I can give an example. The unhealthy sex that I had in the past and today I have the virus of the HIV was just because of the unhealthy ways. I did. I'm talking for myself.
Personally.
There's not much to most people.
Sure.
And that's my opinion.
Okay. Do we have a hand back there?
Well, I was going to say sex is one of the major driven forces of capitalism.
One of the forces of capitalism. Okay.
One of the higher forces that drive capitalism because everything is advertised through sex.
Because it recognizes how powerful it influences us, right?
Yep.
TJ?
And this is my just opinion. I think a healthy sexual expression is something that expands love, and I think an unhealthy expression contracts it.
It's a beautiful way of putting it. Healthy sex expands love. Unhealthy contracts love, right? This notion of sex and love, right?
Sex is divine. It's how you do the habits that can be unhealthy or healthy.
It's how you do the habits that can be healthy or not healthy. Isabella, our sociologist in the room? Okay. All right, so then we've examined a few points about sex itself. So before we go any further into gender, male, female, let's actually examine the sexual energy. And we use the book by André Luiz, which the physician spirit, Dr. André Luiz, channeled by the medium Chico Xavier, a book called Action and Reaction, where he describes beautifully that sex is not an immutable energy of nature. It works upon the soul. It is variable, as it says here. Variable energy of the soul, with which it works upon nature. With which it works upon nature. And in which it develops, perfecting itself, right? So Dr. Alberto Almeida, who's also a fabulous psychologist and a very, very renowned spiritist speaker in Brazil, has a whole lecture on sexuality where he describes the evolution of the sexual principle, this energy, all the way back from the mineral stages, progressing to the to the vegetable kingdom, to the animal kingdom, finally reaching such a complexity where it arrives in the human stage with already an ability to express emotions and feelings and sentiments, which is where we tie in the love component to sex, where it's not just primal instinct anymore. And André Luiz elaborates saying that this sexual energy, this creative impulse, is present everywhere in creation, from the communion of subatomic principles to the attraction of the heavenly bodies, manifesting the power of love generated by the infinite love of God. So even at a chemical level, he describes that the union between hydrogen and oxygen particles to create water, that impulse alone can be likened to the sexual impulse, sexual energy. Not from what we understand as sex, but the creative impulse. And he says, the harmonious action of the sun in the celestial bodies stabilizes its family of worlds and nourishes their existence, is also the result of this same energy on a cosmic plane. And then he offers a very interesting notion which I never stopped to think about, which was the sacrifice of Jesus Christ in the cross. And he asks, wouldn't the very influence of Christ, who let himself be crucified, in his devotion to us, in order to fertilize our minds with light for our own divine resurrection, essentially be the same principle applied at the highest level of sublimation? In other words, isn't that attitude perhaps one of the highest sublimated expressions we can conceive of on earth, of a sexual energy, sexual donation in that sense, so quintessential, so sublimated, where completely neglects the self, a complete selfless sacrifice for the love, the universal love of the brothers and sisters on earth. So that's the sexual energy. And as Jailton said, and we highlight here, it's of a mental substance. It's mental, right? Our spirit uses the physical brain to create the sexual memories and fantasies, and the consequence of them are physical reactions. Erection in men, the moisture of the vagina in women. These are physical consequences, but of a mental activity. So that's the sexual energy. So now that we've covered a little bit of that, let's start going into the male and the female. So in 1857, just by having 3 questions in a book called the Spirit's Book, Kardec was able to rupture a paradigm on how we understand sexuality as a whole, just by simply asking 3 questions to the spirits through the mediums he was working with. And question 200 is revolutionary. He asks, are spirits, male and female? The answer is quite succinct but very profound. Not as you understand it, because sex depends on organic composition. Love and sympathy exist among spirits, but they are based on affinity of sentiments. Love and sympathy exist among spirits, but they are based on affinity of sentiments. They're not based on physical, mechanic copulations. So, spirits, male and female. Right here, he's making us understand that the spirit itself is not subscribed to a gender necessarily. So then, of course, Kardec asks another question, if they cooperate. Here we go. Can a spirit who has animated the body of a man animate the body of a woman in a new existence, and vice versa? Answer is yes, since the same spirit can animate both male and female bodies. So in a very basic answer, Kardec is making sure that we're able to distinguish between bodies, physical bodies that are male and female bodies, versus spirits, which don't have gender necessarily. And then the last question was the consequence of that. Well, when we are spirits, in other words, when we are disincarnate, right? We are all spirits here, but we are temporarily incarnate in a physical body. So when we are spirits without the physical body, in our natural state, do we have a preference as to whether we will incarnate into a male or female body? It matters little to a spirit. It depends on the trials it must undergo. It matters little to a spirit. By a show of hands, does it matter to you? It matters to me. Right? That notion, it matters little to a spirit, is so liberating and at the same time so scary in our current awareness as conscious incarnate beings. Because we're so conditioned by all of the filters of society, by our cultural legacies, by everything we were fed to by our parents in society, that we assumed a role, an identity. And that identity is attached to a gender. But then, when you are in the state of spirit, it matters little. Depends on the trials it must undergo. So, it's amazing how the perception is different when you don't have the physical body, right? Okay, so just these three questions by themselves make any sexual manifestation what? Normal. It normalizes sexual orientation as we know it. Makes it natural. Right? We're going to go into more detail. It's not all black and white, cut and dry like that, but that's the first notion we get. So from that, we get all the sociological and psychological aspects. So because we know that the spirit doesn't have a gender, and it matters little to the spirit what gender is going to reincarnate in, what matters is the trials that it must undergo, and based on that it will choose, or not, depending on the circumstances, but let's just say for now, it will choose the gender that will reincarnate to fulfill such a specific task. Then what they say in the book Sex and Destiny, which is in the process of being translated as we speak, and hopefully it will be published in the next few months, by the medium Chico Xavier and the spirit author Dr. André Luiz. Based on this, they say total masculinity or total femininity are non-existent in the human personality from a psychological standpoint. Men and women in spirit display a certain percentage, higher or lower, of male or virile and female feminist characteristics in each individual, which does not assure the possibility of normal intimate behavior for all according to the concept of normality as established in social context by the majority of humankind. Do we get what they're saying here? It's quite profound, right? And because this book hasn't yet been translated, I had to translate the sentence, so it's not very well translated. It's one big, long sentence. But what do we gather from this sentence here?
If you can rephrase.
So there is no such thing as total masculinity or total femininity from the psychological standpoint. Why is that?
Within both men and female, male and female, require existence.
Because the spirit goes through a succession of reincarnations, sometimes in the male, sometimes in the female form. So this also gives rise naturally to the phenomenon of bisexuality. In fact, when they do studies and statistics, they see that it's actually like a bell curve shaped like this, where the majority of beings have bisexual tendencies, which doesn't mean they're going to act on them. It doesn't mean that it's going to destabilize them emotionally or psychologically. It's just a byproduct of the journeys that they've traveled in both male and female forms. There's a minority of beings on one side of the curve which have a predominantly masculine energy, and a minority on the other side of the curve that have a predominantly feminine energy. But that's like, we're talking really predominant, like overpowering. And so in those cases, usually the spirit will have to transition into the opposite gender for new trials and reincarnations in order to balance out, as my friend Isabella contributed some material for me, to balance out these two energies for the spirit to be able to walk in equilibrium. So from this, the sociological aspects we get are just some here, which we're going to talk about, are gender, male or female. Now we go to gender roles. What are gender roles? The gender roles are what I should do as a woman, what I should do as a man, according to my society, to my culture. So in a jokingly way, 20, 30 years ago, it was very common to hear in Brazil, people saying the woman's place is in the kitchen. If they were to say that today, they would be trampled. And they, with good reason, they deserve to be trampled. So these are the gender roles. I am a woman, I am a man, so I have to behave in certain ways, right? And then we go to gender and psychological identities. Now, that's different than gender roles, right? Gender roles are what the female form needs to do in a society. Gender and psychological identities is what the spirit that's in that physical body feels. So a spirit may be temporarily reincarnated into the body of a man, but have a psychological identity of a woman. And so doesn't mean that it's not man or a woman. It is a woman, but with a more predominant psychological identity of a man, or vice versa. And that, of course, will influence its sexual orientation, its sexual behaviors. Cultural influences, right? It can have a profound effect depending on the culture you're born in. From your parents, you are going to be conditioned and you're going to inherit a lot of information, a lot of behavior, a lot of tendencies, a lot of customs, some of which are very enlightened and very healthy, some of which are not so enlightened or so healthy. But that's the baggage you're going to be handed by your parents, who in turn got it from their parents. And then you will go to your school, and your school will condition you according to its culture and its customs. So the spirit will start adopting and molding its own psychological identity based on the filters and based on this information that he'll get from his parents and from the culture around him. And then finally, we go into sexual orientation and sexual behavior, which we'll explore in the next slide. And then sexual addictions, right? Which are behaviors that go haywire, basically. And this is the hardest part of the lecture, switching slides. Here we go. Thank you. Yeah, I went two more. I came back. Thank you. Okay, so this is an important one to talk about quickly. Does anyone know the difference between sexual orientation versus sexual behavior? What is sexual orientation? Or sexual preference is also known.
Predisposed.
Okay, so what the spirit brings with it, right? Versus behavior. So according to André Moreira, Dr. André Moreira, in his book Homosexuality, which is in English and it's available for sale here if you guys are interested, fascinating book. The definition that he gives to sexual orientation is the desire and affective sexual interest. And he emphasizes, note the use of sexual but also of affective of the individual, which determines which sex the person feels realized in an intimate partnership, versus sexual behavior, and parentheses, choice, free will, the conscious decision to live or not, the orientation, accept it or suppress it. And as TJ offered earlier for us, which was a great reminder, is anything that we suppress or that we squander, its expression will happen sooner or later, and most likely will not come out in a normal, healthy, natural way. It will come out in an unhealthy, in a traumatized way. And that's an open door for sexual behavior that will lead to sexual addictions, which we're going to talk about. Is this distinction clear?
Can I ask one question? Would you say then that sexual orientation is a predisposition to the spiritual destiny?
Yes and no. It could also be influenced by your environment. So, for example, prison inmates, their psychological identity is not as homosexual sometimes, but they will act out homosexual behavior by engaging in sex with people of the same gender because their environment is one where they just act out. But they're not necessarily identified with that, right? And we'll see how other conditionings that parents imprint in the child, or puberty, which is a very, very crucial and delicate stage in the development of the child, may go through traumatizing experiences where the spirit will rationalize for itself that even though it may have been predisposed from previous reincarnations to have either a homosexual or a heterosexual orientation, because of the traumas it experiences, it may change its course and sort of be forced into something until sooner or later in their life, maturity and the culture and the environment will give them an opportunity to liberate himself or herself. And the famous so-called coming out of the closet, as we all know about it. So these are, essentially, there's not a yes or no answer to this question because it's a very individual, it's case by case, right? So behavior, conscious decision to live or not the orientation, accept it or suppress it. And that brings us to guilt. And I love this picture because for me it speaks 1,000 words. Right? So what TJ read earlier for us in the book, Our Daily Bread, is basically a complete reflection of the passage of Paul in Romans, where he affirms, I know and am certain. Look at that conviction in the way he says it. I know and am certain in the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean in itself, except to the one who regards it as such. So, without a shadow of a doubt, Paul is affirming to us that sex, in and of itself, is divine, is pure, is clean, is sacred, right? What happens, though? As Emmanuel says, people demand sexually instructive programs. Yes, such programs might be useful, but only when the holy notion of divinity of this creative power is more widespread. For as long as uncleanliness remains in the heart of those who analyze or teach, such methods will be nothing more than uncleanliness. So it's very recent, only in the 1960s, that we finally as a society, at least a Western society, had a breakthrough in the sexual revolution, where the taboos were a little bit shattered and people started talking about this information a little more openly. But up until then, this was suppressed, and suppressed in very violent ways sometimes. So you can imagine living, which we all did at somewhere at some point as eternal spirits that reincarnate many times, in the Middle Ages. Can you imagine having parents that were enlightened enough to observe the sexual behavior of a child and embrace it and normalize it and foster it so that the child feels empowered? Do you think that would be the natural course of action back then? Probably not. Most likely not. In fact, a lot of abuse, a lot of rape, a lot of many other negative things were the norm in the society. So the spirit arrives in a new body of a child as a clean slate with an opportunity to start again, put into practice, carry out the tasks that it came to carry out, and then it's bombarded by this very hostile environment. So it's actually very common back then, and even today, I would say to a certain extent, where children that are in the process of puberty then start realizing things about their sexual nature, and their society, their culture, has taught them to suppress it and to make it into abomination, that sometimes their course of action would be, I'm going to go to the seminar, I'm going to become a priest, or I'm going to become a nun. And back then, I'm sure a lot of parents thought that way. Oh, I think this child of ours may have some questionable tendencies here. We want to avoid an embarrassment as much as possible. Go become a priest. Go become a priest. And what happens? As a person becomes a clergyman back then, celibacy. Suppress it even further. And also there's a material, practical element to that, because the church needed to keep centralized its wealth and power, and if it allowed its clergymen to have children, then those children would be entitled to inheritance, and property would have to be divided. So of course there's a practical element to that. But think about all the guilt ancestrally that we've sown through so many reincarnations, generations, by looking at sex as something perverted, abominable, as a sin, right? So this is one of the greatest challenges that we, as spirits that have a big baggage, including of sexual history, need to be able to overcome, need to be able to normalize inside of ourselves. Remove the guilt, remove the judgment. Nobody's here to judge anybody else, right? But what happens? I just forgot one example. It's natural. We were talking earlier about sexual behaviors, right? So if a sexual orientation that is natural is suppressed, is made into an abominable thing, the child or the young adult will start rationalizing for him or herself, saying, okay, if this is how people are telling me that I am, then it means that this is something perverted. If this is something perverted or something that's not healthy, then it's only natural that I seek out ways to express it that are just as abominable. And so that's where addictions come in. That's where sexual behaviors such as sadomasochism, pedophilia, addiction to pornography, excessive masturbation, where the spirit realizes it consciously, all of the side effects of these behaviors, and yet is unable to control himself or herself from carrying it out anyways. Because a fundamental component of that is guilt. So one of the tasks here tonight is let's remove ourselves from any and all guilt. Yes? Okay. I saw this very interesting quote from a spiritualist sociologist, and I thought I'd offer for you guys as well. It's very cosmopolitan 2014 advice in our Western culture of friends with benefits and no strings attached and some of these things we hear around. And she says it very clearly in a simple way, sincerely. Pay attention to whom you share your intimate energy with. Intimacy at this level intertwines your oral energy with the oral energy of the other person. These powerful connections, regardless of how insignificant you think they are, leave spiritual debris, particularly within people who do not practice any type of cleansing, physical, emotional, or otherwise. What are they referring to here? No spiritual discipline of any kind, right? Don't take good care of themselves. The more you interact intimately with someone, the deeper the connection and the more of their aura is intertwined with yours. Imagine the confused aura of someone who sleeps with multiple people and carries around these multiple energies. What they may not realize is that others can feel that energy, which can repel positive energy and attract negative energy into your life. I always say, never sleep with someone you wouldn't want to be. Isn't that insightful? Never sleep with someone you wouldn't want to be yourself. Because it is very true what she says. This energetic exchange that Paulo says, the most powerful energetic exchange we can have, inevitably does not get disconnected at the end of the physical act. It stays with you. We know that we have the chakras of energies and that the basic chakra is very powerful. The quality of that energy is very powerful. And it's almost like magnetic waves are sent back and forth whenever the spirit thinks of the person. And if the spirit thinks of the person in a sexual way, almost like fantasizing, then it feeds that thought with a lot of emotion, with a lot of very intense feelings. And we know that the more intense the feeling, the more powerful that wave is. So it gets sent to its destination. Now, if sex is mental in nature, and we're here on this planet to carry out many, many tasks that require our intellectual ability, imagine being able to carry out those tasks on a daily basis when you are being bombarded by the sexual energy of 5, 6, 7 different partners that you've been sleeping with regularly. And those partners themselves, because you inevitably will get that energy into your oral field as well, right? So people report exhaustion. They're drained. They can't concentrate. These are things we hear on a regular basis. So, Dr. Anete Guimarães is a very renowned spiritist doctor and scientist in Brazil, and she has an 8-hour-long seminar online about sexuality. For those of you that speak Portuguese, I highly recommend watching it. It's quite insightful. We don't have time to go through all of the insights that she offers in this 8-hour-long seminar, but so Dr. Anete explains in a study that researchers did of patients that had become paraplegic, so irreversible damage in their medulla, in their back, by accident, which caused them to have no more movement, paraplegic from the waist down. This group of scientists was trying to come up with rehabilitation methods in order to help these patients. And in the process of doing that, they interviewed a lot of these patients. And they found, surprisingly, that a small percentage of these patients continued to engage in sexual intercourse with their spouses. And they were very puzzled by that. So wait a minute, they don't have sensations. They're paralyzed from the waist down, and yet they're having sexual activity. So they started to find out more from it. And they realized that this small group of people, compared to the larger percentage whose relationships pretty much fizzled out and ended when they were not able to keep having sexual interactions, the small percentage of the group that kept having sex with their spouses, they noticed that not only they were able to have erections, but to reach full orgasms. So they started to figure out how is that possible, because there is no more connection here. They have no movement from the waist down. And that's where the spirit layer comes in beautifully here. Turns out that this area of the brain, where's my pointer? Right here. That this area of the brain, the limbic system, is also known as the pleasure center. This area of the brain is highly active during sexual activity. Now, they make a clear distinction based on this research. In order to come up with an explanation, they made a clear distinction between what is known as orgasm versus pleasure. Orgasm is physical. It's in the genitals. It's a physical reaction from mental impulses, but it's purely physical. Versus pleasure, which is in the brain. So then, these two differences cause what? Partial sex and total sex. What is partial sex? So when we are in a sexual activity and there is physical stimulation, touching, there's purely tactile, the pleasure center of our brain can get up to, but no more, up to 50% stimulation from this source, physical. The other 50% comes from emotional stimulation, feelings, love, kindness, care, affinity. That's the other 50%. Now, what happens in the limbic system when it is stimulated at 100%? This only happens when the limbic system reaches 100% stimulation. What happens is that it shuts down. And when it shuts down, it starts to send a lot of neurotransmitters to all the other parts of the brain that are responsible for our senses, our vision, our sight, our hearing, our smell. So we start looking at the world through rose-colored glasses. We start hearing the birds out, and we hear song. We hear, really, that's when people are reporting that sensation of elation, where everything is beautiful, colors are heightened, smell is heightened, traffic, the cab drivers honking their horns, look at the melody in the air, so beautiful. That's really when the limbic system, when the pleasure center is sending those, just a wave of chemicals to the rest of the brain. What happens when that takes place? They call them adrenaline suppressants. So they allow us to come down from a pleasure, a full orgasm, which is 50% physical stimulation plus 50% emotional stimulation, in a much faster way. So our heartbeat goes down, we feel the sense of elation, serenity, joy, we're fulfilled. And this sensation can last up to 48 hours. So you're walking on clouds, you truly are in love, you had an emotional experience that was pure, that was divine through the act of sex. But there was this extra component here that allowed the pleasure center to shut down and irrigate the rest of your brain with these very, very powerful neurotransmitters. So when does that happen? Only at, let's see if you're paying attention, 100%. So it is what? Required for emotional stimulation to take place. 50% physical stimulation will not get 100%. for the pleasure center. So then what happens? Dr. Guimarães talks about the sexual tension that we all experience. So when we are engaging in a sexual activity, and when we reach an orgasm versus pleasure, when we reach an orgasm that's purely physical, and it's partial sex, when we come down from our heartbeats, we never are able to come back down to the place we started before we were engaging in that activity. We come down, but it takes longer for us to come down, and we come over here somewhere. We don't go all the way down. What happens? Sexual tension. And the more you engage in this type of activity, the more built up sexual tension you acquire. How are you able to fully come down to the zero in the graph? Only with total sex or sex with love. That's the only way that the brain will produce all of the necessary neurotransmitters to allow you to go down to a full state of elation and relaxation and fulfillment and serenity, etc., etc., etc. So then what happens is that there are a lot of us walking around with such pent-up sexual tension that everything we see and we hear, we associate with sex. And that's where the power of the media and advertisement comes in. They notice that, they know that, and so they use the media to further fuel our desires, because most of us are walking around with a lot of sexual tension. To the point where she describes in her lecture, it starts affecting the development of children. So that, for example, a young boy needs to receive the maternal nourishment of his mother, the opposite sex, in order to have a balanced, healthy upbringing through his formative years. The young girl needs the same from the father. Now, it just so happens that the men, more than the women, have more of this sexual tension given the physical anatomy of the man versus the woman. The women are more on the emotional nourishment side. So that sometimes a father who is a man of integrity and ethics is so filled up with sexual tension that when his little young daughter comes to give him a hug so spontaneously, he immediately reacts and shuns her because he's afraid of causing a sexual response in him. Why? Because he's got so much sexual tension built up. Does the daughter understand that? No. How does the daughter react to that? Rejection. I'm not loved. I'm rejected. How does she grow up psychologically with that scar? She'll try to seek in other relationships, in adult men, the nourishment that she was not able to get from her father. So this is the point where the sexual tension starts influencing our relationships in the household, in the school, in our society. So fascinating conversation and topic, but I wish we could be able to go further into it. But suffice it to say that with 100% total sex is only possible if there is emotional stimulation as well, which is basically what we're talking about here. Sex combined with love. Any questions so far? You're all so quiet. My. Okay, so the orgasm is merely a physical repercussion of a mental thought. You stimulate something physically, you cause an orgasm, which is very different from the sexual pleasure coming from the brain, right? So we have to get that distinction, which actually may explain why some people, for example, report that when they're engaged in the act of masturbation, for example, that afterwards they don't necessarily feel so alive and nourished and happy, but they report the opposite effect. They feel a little drained, a little tired. Some people and some scientists might say that there are benefits associated to masturbation, where there's a release from stress and so on, which from a biological perspective might be true. But from an energetic point of view, if you understand that we have sexual energy that we are exchanging in an act of sex with love, then we are exteriorizing, we are donating energy, but then we're also receiving energy. And that receiving nourishes, replenishes, revives us, gives us the vitality so that that cycle happens in a beautiful way, profound way. But if you're just exteriorizing and there is no emotional connection to that act, then you're really just giving away some vitality. And in fact, the topic in Spiritism of obsession is a vast topic, which we can't really go into detail now because we don't have time, but we can say that obsessions would really only occur in situations of partial sex. Because when you do have total sex, the understanding is that you have love. Where there is love, there is God. Where there is God, there is protection. There is sincere intentions. There is energies in the room that will be of such an elevated nature that will naturally protect the environment. So when you're in the partial sex situation, it's an open door for any kind of sexual energy that might be around. And we know that with the death of the physical body, does anything change? No. We just don't have the physical body anymore. But all of the virtues that we acquired and all of the vices we take with us. And so we know that there are a lot of us, brothers and sisters, that are no longer with a physical envelope, that have deep sexual desires and needs. And they have no other way of fulfilling them unless it is through us incarnates. And so what they describe as the phenomena of vampirism, or the literal suction of energy, occurs in these environments of partial sex, when the sex is just done for sex's sake, in environments where there is no love, where there is no higher purpose, right? That's something to also keep in mind. And along that same line, yes?
The last minute, please. Just a question.
Yeah.
For me, it's not clear the difference between orgasm and pleasure. My idea is maybe you substitute
The terminology.
Yeah, the terminology.
Maybe,
Not the idea, your idea.
You're right.
myself, but-
You're right. So the pleasure is in the brain, and it's what I'm referring to as 100% total sex. That elation, that fulfillment that you've reached.
Yeah, but to split out orgasm and pleasure, it's for me it's a bit strange.
Right. With orgasm, understanding that it's purely anatomical. It's physical. It's located in the genitalia. From stimulation, you cause an orgasm.
It's a kind of sort of pleasure, right?
Yes, absolutely, temporary.
Yeah, but it-
When you come down from it, you have sexual tension built up. So yeah, it is a pleasurable experience, the orgasm. But we're not referring to the total mental pleasure, that fulfillment you get, that elation. Maybe it's just a question of terminology, but for the purposes of this conversation, orgasm is purely physical.
Sure. But another reason why I maybe the realization would be interesting is because the concept of love,
Mhm.
I can't split out from, we can't split out from sex, and at least in the social discussion, the concept or discussion about sex and don't talk about love, for me it's impossible. So
Right.
and love, that is always expectations and projects that we put upon someone and some project. So it's another reason why I would substitute pleasure for realization. Because a total sex, it would be more, I feel more old.
Sure. Wholesome,
Yeah.
divine, yeah, connected, absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah, so maybe we can define it orgasm versus full realization. There we go. Thank you. So this brings us to one of the last slides, which is in sexual behavior. Then we have this conversation that sometimes we hear in society about monogamy versus polygamy, right? So, and there are some theories that say, oh, you know, we as mammals in our species, we're meant to be polygamists. But then, if that's the case, then the offspring that's born from the mother would have to be self-sufficient and independent from the first few months so that the mother can go out and be a polygamist and vice versa. Because polygamy, for true polygamy's sake, has to be for both sexes, right? we've had the ancestral idea of polygamy, but just for the males. Men can have many wives, but oh wow, if a wife decides to have more than one husband, that's a big no-no. So that's not really polygamy. That's a male-dominated patriarchal society imposing a rule on one of the sexes. It's not really polygamy, right? So I just thought this example might be an interesting analogy to correlate between the notion of polygamy and monogamy with this passage of the gospel, where Christ says, "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house. But it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell. And great was the fall of it." But it's a bit of an analogy for us to understand that we have such limited time on this planet, and such a long list of duties and tasks we're supposed to carry out, and limited mental capabilities to direct and channel those energies for those tasks, that if we choose to preoccupy ourselves with polygamist lifestyles, and here I am not judging, please understand I am not judging, I'm just merely talking about it, that there might be a possibility that the expenditure of energy in order to maintain those multiple relationships might be to such an extent that there is very little energy left over for you to really dedicate for constructive tasks. So the idea of the house on the sand versus on the rock, I think illustrates that a little bit, because if everything is on the up and everything is great, then you are engaging in this lifestyle. Presumably there might be nothing wrong with it. But sooner or later, when the rain comes and the floods and the wind, chances are it may be harder to be able to rely on somebody who's be truly there to provide you the necessary support and join hands with you to go through the storm. It might be much more likely if you were within a monogamous relationship where you took the time to commit yourself to really getting to know the other person, to making some sacrifices of your own in understanding the other person, in really learning to forgive. All of those tasks, all of those challenges that we as spirits know we came here to fulfill in this life, as opposed to giving free rein to our sexual desires, right? Why is it that sex has become so animalized and disturbed in its manifestations? Well, naturally, because we bring from our past the baggage of these behaviors, right? Which back then, we were more animalistic in nature, and we carry them out more widespread. But as we learn, as we understand, we start to hear the words, and we start becoming aware of the spiritual truths. Our conscience starts to naturally awaken to them. It becomes harder and harder to suppress and ignore, because as we engage in those sexual acts that we feel in our spirit are lacking in love, we will experience more consequences, and the feelings of guilt and those components will be heightened in us. So an invitation for us to use those energetic resources that we have of sex and put them to good use towards one person. Now, there is an example in Nosso Lar, the first book that was channeled by André Luiz, where he's in the spirit realm and he visits a friend in a house who is a man who lives with two women. His first wife, and then when that wife died, he, a few years later, found another wife and married her. The three of them live in the house, in the same house in the spirit realm. And André Luiz was at first a little taken aback by that. But then they, in such a simple and heartfelt way, explained that our community, a communion of affinity and sentiments here is of such a noble and purified nature that there is no ego-driven jealousy between me and the first wife and the second wife. We truly love one another here, and we chose to gather together to continue evolving. So from that point of view, you could perhaps label that arrangement as polygamist. But I think in the spirit world, it might be easier if you have no animalistic tendencies from being incarnated into a physical body. Because this is the material nature that we're in. This is a physical world. One of the greatest challenges that we hear a lot in a lot of the books is, are we going to let the material nature around us animalize our spirit? Or are we going to rise above that influence and let our spirit spiritualize the matter around us? Right? This is fulfilling the will of God. This is why the Creator created a physical universe within which we perfect ourselves, and in the process, help the environment around us spiritualize itself through our own sheer efforts. So, like I said, this may have been very instructive, but not necessarily heartfelt. So, I would love to be able to imprint a feeling in the end of this lecture. So, I would like to offer a musical example, I'm sure Thiago knows, of this opera Tannhauser, which perfectly encapsulates a lot of the sexual struggles that we all go through here, and illustrates a lot that we just talked about today. As we watch the last 7 minutes of this opera, I'll give you a synopsis of it so we can have a nice setup before we press play. So Tannhauser is a knight from the medieval times who found a beautiful woman by the name of Elizabeth. He falls in love with Elizabeth. Elizabeth is a soul that is so devout, so purified, so Christian, that he falls in love for her purity, for that energy. Thing of Tannhauser, though, is that he struggles with his sexual desires, his carnal desires. And in order to fulfill those desires, he runs away to this place called the Venus Mountain, where the Venus Mountain symbolizes all of the excesses of the flesh. So all of the sexual behaviors in excess, he goes there, fulfills them. When he's satiated, he comes out of the Venus Mountain, and he's overburdened with a sense of guilt, with remorse. And it becomes, every time he goes, it becomes harder and harder for him to stare into the eyes of Elizabeth, because he feels he's unworthy. He feels he's not pure enough to deserve her love, because he keeps going back and giving reins to his desires. Now, it's interesting that the word Elizabeth in Hebrew is Eli Sheba, which means from God in abundance. So even though the name Elizabeth has a deep symbolism, from God in abundance. So it's a love of God which gives abundance, which gives the replenishment, provides you with the sensation of being satiated. Sex with love, remember? So what happens? Tannhauser gets to a point where he can no longer live with himself. So he makes a commitment. He goes onto a pilgrimage to the Vatican in order to ask for forgiveness for his sins, gain the absolution from the Pope, and come back with his soul redeemed so he can finally marry Elizabeth and be at peace with his conscience. So off he goes with his sincere devotion and desire on the pilgrimage to the Vatican. What happens? He arrives in the Vatican, he confesses his sin, and the Pope says, the Venus Mountain. Not only will I not absolve you of your sins, but I'm going to excommunicate you. Because it is more likely, and he's holding a big staff, you know, the staff of the Pope, that it is more likely for fresh green plants to blossom from this staff right here than for your soul to gain salvation because you went to the Venus Mountain. So, excommunicated. Of course, Tannhauser is distraught. He is overwhelmed. He comes back to the town and he doesn't know what to do. So right there is also a commentary on judgment of our society, of hypocrisy, of us refraining from judging others, right? When he comes back to the town, he meets his friend who wants to tell him that Elizabeth has died. But he's so overwhelmed by the experience that he had in the Vatican that he's just venting to his friend. And he said, you know what, I don't care anymore. If my soul is already condemned, I might as well go to the Venus mountain. And what's really cool that I wanted to show you in the last 7 minutes of this opera is that there is such an open interaction between the physical realm and the spiritual realm. The characters are basically invoking spirit entities, and the spirit entities manifest. So it's such a cool interplay where they are basically acknowledging the ability of interaction between the spirit realm and the physical realm. So as his friend is realizing that he's invoking the entity Venus so that he can go to the Venus mountain and just get lost there, he's trying to pull his friend back. And as he's trying to pull his friend back, he's feeling the sensations of the energy around that purely sexual, carnal desires. And he finally is able to tell him, look, Elizabeth is trying to pray for you in heaven, for your salvation. She's trying to intercede on your behalf before God. When he says the name Elizabeth, then Tannhäuser has an awakening. Much like the prodigal son's awakening, he comes to his senses and he realizes, Elizabeth. And so he starts on a journey to ask for her forgiveness. And what happens in the end is that you hear the angels basically saying, there is no such thing as eternal hell. The sinner that seeks the compassion of God will never seek it in vain. There will be forgiveness. There will be redemption. And they show that the staff, this is based on legend, it may be true, the staff of the priest is full of greens. So symbolizing the redemption of that soul and of forgiveness. So based on all that we talked about with sexual behavior and guilt and desire versus spiritual love, things like that, let's watch together